The curtain didn't slide. It snapped. Heavy fabric tore sideways, the metal track clicking twice before stopping, a sound that didn't belong in first class. I noticed because everything else had been quiet enough that small errors carried weight. I was already seated. The residence was intact when we arrived. Seats 1A and 1B, verified twice, once in the lounge, once at the aircraft door. The scanner gave a clean tone, short and final. The flight attendant nodded before the screen finished loading. I registered that. The nod came early. Elaine brushed the armrest with her fingertips. Leather. Cool. Unmarked. She smiled, then checked the boarding pass again, folding it once along the crease. 40 years together leave habits intact, even when circumstances change. I set my notebook on the table. It landed a fraction off center. I slid it back until the edge aligned with the wood grain. Old habit. I logged service patterns. No complaints. Sequences. A cup of coffee sat waiting on the side console. Lid secured, no logo facing outward. I moved it slightly so the handle didn't point into the aisle. Steam curled and vanished. I made a note. Temperature acceptable. Delivery early. Behind the curtain, the cabin filled. Overhead bins are closing. Shoes stopped where they were told to stop. Voices softening as people found places assigned by a system that usually doesn't argue. Then the interruption came. The curtain was yanked open hard enough to ripple. A woman stepped through first. Tall. White suit. Sunglasses still on despite the low cabin lighting. She didn't look at Elaine. She didn't look at me. Her eyes moved through the space the way someone inspects a room they expect to control. A man followed her, arms wrapped around bags with leather tags still sheathed in plastic. She stopped at the table. Without asking, she placed her bag on my lap. Not dropped. Set. The way someone sets an object where resistance is not anticipated. Kevin, she said, already turning away. Why is housekeeping sitting in my suite? The word landed before the bag finished settling. Elaine inhaled once. Sharp. Controlled. She didn't speak. She slid her boarding pass closer to her thigh and folded her hands over it. I felt the weight on my knees, rigid, structured, unfamiliar. Kevin appeared at her shoulder. Young. Too alert. His eyes flicked to her sunglasses, then to the bag, then to my face. He did not check the tablet in his hand. One moment, Miss Grant, he said. Not to us, to her. I lifted the bag by its handle and placed it on the floor just inside the aisle. Upright. No scuff, no sound worth noting. Please don't put your belongings on me, I said. My voice stayed level, the kind used to confirm a name or repeat an address. She turned then, looked at me as if an object had responded incorrectly. Her mouth opened, then closed. Did he just, she began, then stopped. She snapped her fingers toward Kevin instead. Fix this. Kevin nodded. Again, before the data. These seats, he said, finally glancing at the tablet, are usually reserved. They are, I said, for the people whose names appear on the manifest. Elaine leaned closer, her shoulder barely touching mine. Daniel, she said quietly, are you sure? I'm sure, I said. Kevin cleared his throat. Sir, maybe we can step into the galley for a moment. The word sir arrived late, added, not embedded. We stood. In the aisle, I noticed something small I hadn't before the seatbelt sign above us was still dark. Boarding wasn't complete. There was time. Time matters when it hasn't been weaponized yet. In the galley, Kevin lowered his voice. She's a frequent presence, he said. It's easier if... If what? I asked. If you move, he said. We can offer business class, a voucher. For seats we paid for, I said. He hesitated. People like her, he said, then corrected himself. Vips. Through the curtain, I heard her laugh. Short. Brittle. Something hitting a hard surface and failing to bounce. I looked back toward the suite. Elaine was still standing where I'd left her, posture straight, hands folded. The boarding pass lay face up on the table now, visible without effort. Kevin followed my gaze. For the first time, he paused. I'll get the captain, he said. The word stayed between us longer than it needed to. Captain, I nodded. Please do. As he turned away, I noticed the tablet in his hand again. The manifest page hadn't refreshed. The loading circle was still spinning. Behind us, the curtain shifted once more. And I understood then the system hadn't failed yet. It was deciding whose eyes it would trust. The word captain altered the sequence. Not immediately. Nothing visible changed at first. The cabin didn't react. The light stayed steady. What shifted was order, what moved first, and what stopped moving altogether. Kevin stepped away from the galley. His absence narrowed the space. Panels closed. A latch clicked once, then settled. Somewhere forward, a door opened and shut. The sound traveled down the corridor and stalled just short of the residence. I remained where I was. The curtain parted again. This time it wasn't pulled. It was guided aside, slow enough to avoid sound. A different hand. The captain stopped at the threshold. One foot remained in the aisle. The other never crossed into the suite. His hand rested on the seat back behind ours, not on the seats themselves. Fingers curled. Pressure without contact. His eyes moved in order. Elaine. Me. The woman in white. Familiarity registered between them. No greeting that needed explanation. The captain spoke once to establish the position. Ms. Grant. She adjusted without being told. Sunglasses came off. Shoulders squared. She leaned back into the seat she had already occupied, her heel resting on the ottoman, as if it had always been hers. The captain turned toward us. His gaze paused on the boarding pass, lying face up on the table, long enough to acknowledge it existed, not long enough to read it. His eyes dropped next to the bag on the floor in the aisle. Upright, deliberately placed. A pause followed, measured. Then the instruction came. Please stand up. I did, not in response to tone. In response to the sequence. Standing clarified the field. Elaine's hand brushed my arm once. Not to stop me, to steady herself. She stayed where she was, posture straight, hands folded. The captain did not ask for documents. He did not gesture toward the manifest. His attention stayed on alignment, who was seated, who was not, and which version of order would be simpler to restore before departure. You're being asked to deplane, the posture said, even before words followed. I named it aloud. You're asking us to leave. He nodded. Authority acknowledged itself. The woman in white said nothing. She didn't need to. Her position was already established by the silence around her. Kevin hovered behind the captain now. Tablet on. Screen angled away. The loading circle was gone. Whatever the system had resolved, it had resolved quietly. Kevin didn't look at it. Elaine spoke briefly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She stated sequence boarding when instructed, seating as assigned. Her words landed and passed through the space without effect. The captain shifted his weight. His hand slid from the seat back to the edge of the table, not touching the notebook, not touching the coffee cup, just close enough to register the surface. A claim without contact. The consequence was placed on the table next, not as a threat, as a procedural endpoint. If you refuse, Port Authority will assist. No embellishment followed. The cabin had gone still by then. Conversations paused without anyone turning fully around. Attention pooled, unclaimed, heavy. The kind that waits to see which direction the authority will take. I reached into my pocket. The captain's eyes tracked the movement immediately. I didn't remove the boarding pass. I unlocked my phone. Kevin inhaled once, sharp enough to hear. He didn't speak. The captain's focus shifted not to my face, but to the device. Just a fraction longer than he had looked at the boarding pass moments earlier. I met his eyes. You're making a decision, I said. I'm preparing for its record. He straightened. The threshold between us remained intact. The woman in white crossed her arms. Her foot stayed on the ottoman. Possession maintained. Somewhere forward, a system ticked. Not loudly, not urgently. The kind of sound that only matters when you know what it connects to. The forward motion of the process slowed. Steps are stacked instead of advancing. And for the first time since boarding, authority stopped flowing downhill and began to wait for confirmation. No further instructions were issued. The captain stayed at the threshold. The woman in white stayed seated. Kevin remained behind them, tablet lowered, screen dark. The sequence paused without announcement, as if the system had reached a point where no additional input was required. A status update propagated forward from the galley. Cabin power shifted briefly. Air circulation stopped. Ambient noise dropped with it. No alarms followed. No explanations were offered. The operating state changed and held. The captain looked past me toward the cockpit. His jaw tightened. He did not move. Authority had reached a layer where his role no longer applied. A voice came through the handset near the galley. Not amplified. Short sentences. Confirmations only. The captain listened, answered once, and ended the call. He turned, not toward us, but toward the woman in white. "Miss Grant," he said. She straightened, expecting confirmation. What followed was distance. "Please stand up." She did not. Cabin conditions remained unchanged. Kevin checked the tablet without intending to. Whatever appeared there, he did not share it. The captain spoke again into the handset. Fewer words this time. He set it back in place and looked at me. "Sir," he said, and the title arrived intact. "Please remain where you are." I nodded. Footsteps approached from the jet bridge. More than one set. Their pace suggested coordination rather than urgency. The airline executive entered without introduction. Jacket creased. Tie loosened. He scanned the cabin the way people do when the numbers have already been run. He registered the halted systems first, then the captain, then the woman in white. He stopped in front of Elaine. "I'm sorry," he said. "No qualifiers, no conditions." Elaine acknowledged with a single nod. She did not speak. The executive turned to the captain and said his name once. Nothing else. The stripes came off quietly, one by one. No announcement, no pause. They changed hands and were gone. The woman in white stood then. Slowly. The cabin did not make room for her. "Miss Grant," the executive said without looking at her, "your privileges with this airline are revoked. Effective immediately." She spoke. The words had nowhere to land. Security arrived. Not rushed, not apologetic. They positioned themselves on either side of her and waited. She resisted with language alone. The system had already moved past that phase. She was escorted out first. The captain followed next. Not in uniform, not leading anything. He exited a process he no longer controlled. The executive turned back to us. "Power will be restored after the aircraft is cleared," he said. "Your transportation is arranged." I looked at Elaine. She had already gathered her bag, calm, finished. We walked out together. The aircraft did not power back up. Ground operations flagged the tail number as unavailable. Fuel authorization was suspended. Dispatch pulled the flight from the board without explanation to the cabin. By the time the jet bridge cleared, the route had been reassigned. This aircraft was no longer scheduled to fly that night. The jet bridge was loud with cameras. Questions arrived out of order. We did not answer them. The executive addressed the company's failure. He named the corrective steps. He did not mention us again. We did not wait. Later, the airline issued statements. Training was rewritten. Priority logic was revised. Names were removed from lists they had never qualified for. Within hours, the lease on the aircraft entered default. Control reverted upstream, beyond crew, beyond management. By morning, the airline's wide-body fleet remained grounded pending review. Weeks later, ownership changed hands through mechanisms already embedded in the contract. The brand stayed, the governance did not. Priority logic was rewritten at the source, not the counter. That part was procedural. The decision had already been logged before any explanation was requested. Elaine took my hand as we reached the car positioned at the edge of the tarmac. She squeezed once, not tight, just enough to signal closure. "Ready?" she asked. "Yes," I said. Behind us, the aircraft remained stationary. Engines silent. Ownership clarified. Alignment restored. If you've ever been inside a system that classified you before it verified you, tell us where it happened. Share this story with someone who understands quiet power. And subscribe to Black CEO Tales for more stories where systems are corrected without spectacle.